Magnus Carlsen is the greatest blitz player of all time, so when you're up against him and his machine-like mind, you better be finely tuned and firing on all cylinders, or he will cause you to have a major malfunction, just like he did to Hans Niemann in this epic game that we're about to look at. And I should clarify that when I say Hans Niemann malfunctioned, I am just talking about his mind. Despite all the comments I know I'm going to get suggesting that something else malfunctioned, I'm not going to go there. I want to get right into this amazing game, which is one you may not have seen, or at least not to the extent that I'm going to cover it. Magnus plays some unbelievable moves while using just a few seconds on his clock, sending the commentators into near hysterics as we approach the climax of this complex and beautiful struggle, which is from the recent Speed Chess Championship in Paris and which features Magnus Carlsen playing white and opening the game with e4. We have c5, the Sicilian defense from Hans Niemann, knight to f3, heading into the Moscow variation with bishop to b5 check from Magnus. Hans blocks with knight to d7. Magnus continues c3, supporting the d4 thrust. Niemann responds knight to f6, attacking e4. Queen to e2 defends. The bishop gets kicked around a bit, as expected. Hans grabbing himself some nice queenside space. Bishop goes to c2, it's the best square, giving e4 that double protection, which it's going to need after bishop to b7 from Hans. Now d4 is possible immediately, but Magnus first sends his monarch into his castle to shelter in place. e6 now from Hans, preparing to develop the dark squared bishop. Magnus now achieves his ideal central pawn duo with d4, at which point we have queen to c7 from Hans. Okay, he's eyeing the bishop on c2, maybe trying to hold up knight to d2 since that would block the white queen from defending. Black could then take on d4 and white could not recapture with the pawn the way he'd like to, or else he's going to lose this bishop. Magnus plays bishop to d3, getting out of the view of the queen here, planning knight to d2 next. Bishop e7 now from Hans, preparing to castle, knight b to d2, and now rook to c8. Not really clear why Hans thought this was better than castling. Maybe at this point he's planning on opening the c file? I don't know. The engine actually says it would be better if Black could skip his move than to play this. That's typically not a good sign. But okay, it doesn't seem to be a serious mistake or anything. We now get a4 from Magnus with the double attack on b5, to which Hans responds with the move that is sort of an admission that c8 was not a great place to put his rook. He plays c4. You typically want to place your rooks on files that have the potential to open, and spoiler alert, this C file is not going to be fully open for the rest of the game. Maybe a bit better would have been B takes A4, followed by C takes D4, but the move C4 isn't bad. It does gain some space with tempo on this bishop, which drops back to C2. Hans now hits the center with E5, and this is looking more and more like a Ruy Lopez kind of a structure. Magnus continues with a very Ruy Lopez kind of a plan. He moves his rook toward the center, clearing the f1 square so that after Hans castles, finally, Magnus can play knight to f1, with the standard idea of redeploying to g3 and threatening to jump into that delectable f5 square. Rook f to e8 by Hans is a very strong move, placing the rook opposite the queen, and so threatening to blow up the center with d5. Which would favor Hans since he does have the better piece development. Now before this move rook to e8 was played, d5 would have favored white after e takes d5, but now with this lurking threat to the white queen, Black could get away with something like e takes d4, threatening the discovered attack once this bishop moves somewhere, and Black would actually be the preferred side. So Magnus, realizing that the time is right to close the center, and with a heavy heart, plays d5. Letting go that ideal pawn duo and giving Hans access to the c5 square, which he immediately occupies with knight to c5. He's got some nice pressure on e4 now. But the bishop on b7 is looking a bit pathetic. You'd like to redeploy it to a more promising diagonal with bishop to c8, but someone's in the way, highlighting yet another reason why rook to c8 was not a great move. h3 now from Magnus, which I thought looked a bit odd until I realized that its main purpose is not to prevent a black piece from going to g4, but it's actually to support a potential g4, followed by g5, h4. You can put the knight behind the pawns, with some nice attacking prospects on the king side. And black is in no position to really exploit the exposure of the white king as a result of these pawn moves. So best here for Hans would be to get that rook off of c8, get the bishop to a better diagonal, pointed towards the king side, but he goes terribly wrong now with the move b takes a4. And he's tempting Magnus to capture on c4, which would allow Hans to play knight c takes e4, due to the discovered attack on the white queen. Magnus doesn't go there. He takes the correct pawn with bishop takes a4, hitting the rook on e8, after which Hans decides to give up his beautifully placed knight on c5 with knight takes a4. And after rook takes a4, you really got to question Hans Niemann's judgment here. He's got the split pawns. c4 is weak and being targeted, and it can be attacked further with a knight. So how are you going to save that pawn? Well, Hans has a couple tricks up his sleeve, which if they worked would be great. Unfortunately, they don't, but he begins with a5, opening up that a6 square for his bishop. His idea is to play knight to d7 and then to c5, hitting the rook, who cannot capture on c4, since then there would be bishop to a6, pinning and winning the exchange. Magnus plays bishop to g5, apparently unaware that Hans is planning knight to d7. If the knight were to stay on f6, Magnus would love to trade his bishop for it so that he could get in a quick knight to e3 without losing his e4 pawn. This would be winning for white, but Hans plays knight to d7, saying to Magnus, please, trade your good bishop for my bad bishop. Magnus declines and drops his bishop back to e3. But taking on e7, like so, was actually his best move, and his only winning move. So why would you want to play this? Well, the reason, which is going to sound nuts, only because you are not a chess engine, is that after rook takes e7, you can play an immediate knight to g3, threatening to jump into f5, but also defending the queen. Come again? In what universe does the white queen need any defense? Well, you're about to find out. After g6 from black, it's important to stop knight to f5, white has knight to d2, hitting c4 3 times. If black tries to defend with bishop to a6, then you're just going to pile up on the a pawn. That's not working. But what about knight to c5 with the plan of meeting rook to c4 with bishop to a6? Isn't white just losing? No, because here you have rook takes c5 attacking the black queen, which would be losing for white after the following line: bishop takes e2, rook takes c7, rook takes c7, if this knight hadn't been moved to g3, where it can now recapture on e2. And because that queen was defended, white is now winning with the extra pawn and 2 minor pieces versus the rook. So a very deep idea, nearly impossible to spot in a blitz game, which is why Magnus, in this position, did not play the winning move, bishop takes e7, but instead played the second best move, bishop to e3. To which Hans responds with his strongest move, f5, threatening f4, momentarily sacking the pawn, which Magnus accepts with e takes f5, but after knight to f6, Hans is going to round up the d pawn, which is now lacking protection. Now best here for Magnus is to immediately go after the a pawn with rook d to a1, but he goes for the inferior knight to g3. Apparently assuming his pawn on f5 will need protection. Maybe he's concerned about queen to d7, but there's really no reason to play this instead of rook d to a1, unless you're sure that d7 is going to be the best place for that black queen to go, which it's not. But okay, at least he's developing a piece. Hans grabs on d5 now, so Magnus doubles up on the a pawn here. You shouldn't defend with rook to a8 because then c4 is going to fall. But Hans has a nice idea here, which is to move his e7 bishop, and the square he chooses is f8, giving his rook a view of the center, and so threatening to play knight to f4, with tempo on the white queen, since bishop takes f4 would tactically fail to e takes f4 with the discovered attack on the queen, winning material. But f8 was not the best square for that bishop. d8 would have been superior for a couple of reasons. First, it watches over the sensitive f6 square, where in many lines white can push this pawn, disrupting the security of the black king. It's also eyeing a5, so that after white captures there with the rook, black can move the queen somewhere, exposing the attack on the white rook. But Magnus now grabs on a5, and best here for Hans would be queen to c6, setting up the mating battery, and preventing any knight to g5, knight to e6 anytime soon. But Hans makes a grave error now with the move knight to f4, which looks nice. It's attacking the queen, and again, you can't capture or you're losing material. But after queen to d1, keeping a watchful eye on the f3 knight, Magnus is now threatening bishop takes f4, followed by knight to h5, threatening f6, threatening to capture the pawn on f4. But Hans does have knight to d3, hitting b2. And do you think Magnus is going to defend? Oh no. He's going to get in knight to g5 while he can. That's what he plays, but it isn't best, and it might even throw away the win. Better would have been rook to a7, pinning the bishop to the queen, with the potential to even sack the exchange with rook takes b7, followed by a quick rook to a7 in some lines. f6 is also good, or even b3, trying to undermine the defense of the knight on d3. But let's see what's wrong with the move Magnus plays, knight to g5. His idea is to get in a quick queen to g4 to begin creating threats to the black king, which would be well worth the sacrificed pawn on b2. Only trouble is, Hans doesn't need to take on b2. He plays queen to c6, threatening mate in 1 on g2. Now Magnus could block with f3, but then there's no queen to g4. So instead he plays knight to e4, which is strongest. Hans now challenges the g5 knight with h6, and Magnus sacrifices that knight with queen to g4, incorrectly overestimating his attack and giving Hans a borderline winning position. Queen to h5 actually would have been better with equality. According to the engine, Magnus had an even better move than queen to h5, a winning move, which I don't want to show you yet since this move is played later and I don't want to ruin the surprise. But here's a clue. It's a tricky and forcing way to eliminate black's mate threat on g2. So pause the video and try to work it out if you'd like, but let's look at the move played by Magnus, queen to g4. Hans, of course, accepts the sacrifice piece with h takes g5, and after knight takes g5, Magnus now has 2 pawns for the piece, but it's not worth it. Hans plays the correct bishop to e7, dreaming of taking that knight out, but surely realizing that it is headed for e6. The bishop's there to defend against the mate on g7. Magnus naturally would like to remove this bishop, hence his very natural looking move that he plays next, bishop to g5, which unfortunately is a losing blunder, if he wasn't already losing. Correct was rook to a7, with that threat of rook takes b7, followed by rook to a7, with a big problem coming on g7. The engine then gives knight to f4 as black's best defense. You got to try to eliminate this knight while you can, but then white is able to grab a third pawn for the piece, although black is still better. But after bishop to g5, played by Magnus, and bishop takes g5 from Hans, Magnus is totally lost. His best chance is to play knight takes g5 here and hope for some miracle mate, which black can easily prevent. But after queen takes g5, threatening mate on g7, Hans throws away the win with rook to e7. It looks kind of reasonable. The rook can't be captured, or else there will be mate on g2. But Hans Niemann's actual path to victory would have been rook takes e6, and after f takes e6, there's the crushing knight to f4, hitting g2 with 3 pieces, hitting the pawn on e6, threatening to take on h3, opening this deadly diagonal. White is completely finished. The engine gives f3, and then rook to e8, looking for rook takes e6, followed by rook to g6. If you try to push the pawn with e7, there's queen takes f3. Since after the queen's captured, you got knight takes h3 check with the fork. So just one sample line for you. But in the game, Hans Niemann plays this rook to e7, which would have been winning if not for a near miraculous move that Magnus now finds in only 6 seconds, leaving him with just 20 seconds left on this clock in this 3+1 blitz game. This is why he's the greatest. If you'd like to pause the video and see if you can find the only move to save white here, go ahead. But here it comes in 3, 2, 1, rook to a6. A move which makes the live commentators just lose it. Let's have a quick listen to what they say.
But oh my gosh, rook a6, the rook! Oh, he's Levy when you need him.
He sacrificed the rook!
A6, oh my gosh, and Magnus is turning this around.
Rook takes c6.
What in the world is going on here?
So yeah, I don't think anyone saw this coming, including Hans Niemann. But what does it do besides offer black a rook? Well, its purpose is not hard to work out. Magnus wants to eliminate the checkmate threat on g2 any way he can. So let's look at some options for black. If you take the rook with bishop takes a6, then white can grab on e7, threatening mate in 1. Queen to b7 is the only good defense, and after queen takes d6, white has 3 pawns for the piece and should be able to hold the draw. So next, let's look at queen to d5. This is actually black's best option, maintaining the mate threat. White can play rook to a5, hitting the queen again. And if you go to e4, there's f3. When the check on e1 is not a problem for white, the king can safely hide on h2. So better here would be knight to c5, and after knight takes c5, d takes c5, and rook to g6 from white. The e7 rook is still hit, so rook to f7 is best, but here comes f6. And black is under a lot of pressure. White has the 2 pawns for the piece. The engine says black is still better, though it's not clear if he's winning. But now let's take a look at what Hans Niemann played. He chose to defend his rook on e7 with queen to d7. Not as good as queen to d5 and not winning, but Magnus again has to play incredibly accurately, which he does. His GOAT mode is fully activated and he finds the only move that doesn't lose, and that is rook to b6, simply threatening rook to a7, which will pin the bishop and leave black all tied up in a fatally awkward defense. Best for Hans here is to play bishop to d5. He needs to remove this beast on e6 as soon as possible. But I'm guessing that in the few seconds or less that he had to make a move, both players were getting very low on time here, especially Hans. He was probably worried about rook to a6, hitting that pawn on d6 with 2 rooks. So he plays bishop to c6, just blocking that. But this is a horrific blunder. Magnus responds rook a to a6, which is winning, but he had an even prettier move at his disposal with rook takes c6. And if you take with your queen, you're losing your rook with mate to follow. But after rook takes c6, there's rook to a8 check, rook to c8, rook takes c8 check, queen takes c8, and after queen takes e7, black is only going to be able to delay checkmate by sacking his queen. But in the game, Magnus plays rook a to a6, also winning. He's probably looking to take twice on c6 and then pick up the rook on e7. Now here Hans plays knight to f4, probably looking for knight takes e6, though knight to d5 would be even better. But Magnus strikes first with the crushing rook takes c6. And after rook takes c6, he gives Hans Niemann one more chance, not only to save his game, but to win. What Magnus should play here, which he did not play, is rook to a8 check, which is similar to the line we already looked at with rook to c8, rook takes c8, queen takes c8, queen takes e7, except that here, black can take out the knight with knight takes e6. But after f takes e6, white is nevertheless totally winning with the advanced placement of his queen and the passer on e6. The game will not last long. But Magnus goes horribly wrong. In this position, instead of playing the winning rook to a8, he captures on c6, giving Hans Niemann one more chance to win, which he is just unable to find with only seconds left on his clock, and that winning move is rook takes e6. What are you going to do? Black has an extra piece, both the rooks are attacked. You can try f takes e6, and after queen takes c6, you have a check, but it won't be a perpetual, as the following moves demonstrate. The king runs towards the center, and long story short, white just can't make anything happen with this pawn, since there is the threat of mate on g2. The queen cannot stray from the defense. But getting back to the blunder that Hans played here in extreme time trouble, knight takes e6. This allows f takes e6 from Magnus, equalizing the piece count, and if queen takes c6, then queen takes e7 is curtains for black, but so is the move played by Hans Niemann, queen takes e6, at which point Magnus is a pawn up, but immediately gets to grab another one with rook takes c4, since after queen takes c4, he has queen takes e7. And so after all the smoke is settled and the dust has cleared, we see Magnus emerge with the 2 extra pawns in this easily convertible endgame, which does not require very much commentary at all, as Magnus pushes that b pawn, which will decide the game. And once it gets to b5, in this position, Hans Niemann calls it a day. So what a performance, both Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann playing impressively accurately, especially towards the end with only seconds spent on each move, but at the end of the day, Hans just could not withstand the relentless pressure brought by Magnus, culminating in sudden and catastrophic failure in a position that was already hanging by a thread. So thanks for watching. If you enjoy this type of content and would like to see more, please consider hitting that subscribe button, and I will see you next time.